Greetings, friends. 'Tis I, Hashi, your action movie dad, and today we're brewing up. I can't. Let me just show you what we're up to.
Dad, look at my magic staff.
That's your magic staff?
Like from Onward.
Oh yeah, I love it.
Ooh, can I see it? Hey,
Dude,
I found it.
Guys. Whoa.
Sophie, what did you do? I don't know what. Look, whatever it is, I can fix it. Dad, come back. What happened? Dad. What? My bad. Dad, come back. Come back. Dad, wait.
Today we're going to create some dad legs from Onward. And at the moment I've only seen the trailer, and obviously it's an animated film, but this half-dad really inspired me to try a live-action version of this effect. Of course I couldn't help myself, and yes, at the end of this video I'll also show you how to create an animated version of these legs as well. Now you may never need to create dad legs per se in your video, but perhaps you need a headless horseman, or a zombie with a hole. Maybe you've got something coming over for dinner. I mean, there's lots of reasons that visual effects are used to erase limbs in movies. We're going to stick with the family-friendly look of dad's legs in Onward, and I'll walk you through 3 levels of difficulty you could approach this effect with. This episode could be helpful for anyone using After Effects, because today I'm going to talk about a lot of principles that could aid you in a lot of places, including camera tracking, some basic plate projection, some masking tips, and not to mention some particle and lens flare design at the end. In your VFX journey, you'll come across easy shots and hard ones, and as a father, I want to prepare you the best I can, even though I don't know where your particular path is headed. If you want to remove the top half of a character, you're going to want a piece of footage of that character. The easiest, most straightforward way is to use a locked-down camera, film your actor, and roll some extra empty plate at the head or tail of your shot. Remember that the framing of your shot might be different if you're the only subject. Some obvious shooting tips: lock your exposure and focus. If there are going to be visible character shadows in the scene, it'll be some more work, so if you're able to film somewhere where the shadows are pretty diffuse, you'll have an easier time. I've decided to wear a green t-shirt for this test, and I'm making sure to keep my arms folded awkwardly high so they don't intrude on the waistline. And that's my clip. I'll bring this into After Effects, and just for giggles, I'll apply Primat Keyer 6. I'll select this shirt color, expand the selection a bit, restore the foreground, and you know what? Holy smokes. I'll be honest, I didn't really think this was going to work. I filmed this in 8-bit compressed with bad lighting, but once again, Primat is extremely flexible in these situations. In later examples, I didn't use a green shirt, so y'all can see how I deal with that. Spoiler alert, it's harder. And now I'm going to apply Matte Choker. Matte Choker is a really common plugin, and I'll admit that for like 10 years I just kind of futzed with stuff, not really taking the time to appreciate what it could do. Obviously it chokes in your matte, but in case you didn't know, first you can determine the geometric softness, which is basically how round you want your shape to tend toward. You can set a choke amount, and then you can determine how feathered or soft the effect applies. Down at the bottom is a number of iterations, so you can have After Effects apply these transformations multiple times in case you really need to choke a matte. Next, you also have a second set of choke controls. This is perfect for a situation where you want to choke your matte in just a little bit to get rid of artifacts around the screen, but then reinflate that core matte. Consider keyframing these values if you want to do something else magical, like making something sink into the void or walking into walls. Matte Choker's pretty solid. Alright, back to the program. So we've keyed out my shirt. What next? We'll need a background, and since we've got a static shot going here, I'm just going to copy an instance of this footage and freeze a frame from the tail. Now normally I'd suggest a few seconds of plate so there's, some proper video noise and stuff, but I'm lazy and YouTube is compressing this anyway. So, we got a background, now I look, just like a dumb weatherman who wore green to a forecast. And really, I want to look like this awesome weatherman who wore this costume on his forecast. So we'll need to create some mattes out of the bits of me that we don't want and leave the parts that we do. Since this is the layer that has the matte choker, any feathered masks I apply will be affected, so I'm actually going to pre-comp this layer with its effects before I create any masks. Now I can create a matte that kind of goes like this. It'll hover right above the waistline and maybe shoots out to either side a bit. That way I can matte the shadows on the wall over here too. I'll use the feather controls on the mask, adding some feather points right here to keep the matte a little tighter next to the body, and then immediately feather it out over here on the sides where the wall shadow is more visible. Since Primat is doing the fine work right here at the waistline, you probably just need a handful of keyframes for this mask to make the whole thing start to work. And there we go, not too shabby. The next thing he needs is that glowing core, and some light streaks and some particles floating within all that. Now obviously all these need to be married to these pants, which likely means doing some manual tracking. And the After Effects tracker could be helpful for this task, but I'm moving around a lot, so it would likely need a lot of hand-holding. And even if it's really good for some pretty good stretches of the track, whenever I turn my waist, we have a problem, and I need to manually make up for these drifts. But remember how I mentioned I'm lazy like a minute ago? In fact, I'm so lazy that I would like to first see if I can create an elaborate but automated way to track this waistline so I don't have to do so much frame-by-frame tracking. And there should really be a term for this kind of madness where you have to stew on a problem for a while, mash a bunch of effects together to prove you have the wits it takes. Let's see what ingredients I have already. Well, I've got this keyed shirt, and remarkably, that may be all I need to stew mash my way to an easily trackable waistline. The 7 of you who got that will love it. Alright, so watch carefully because this is its own form of magic. I'll place my keyed footage in its own comp, then I'll duplicate that layer and set it as its own inverted alpha matte. That should mean that practically all of it is matting itself out, but if I offset the matte layer, I can create this little belt-sized patch. Because of this offset, the belt will exist all the way through. Now, I'll pre-comp this thing and call it belt, and let me fill in this black and use a matte choker to sort of sand off those dangly pieces. Then I'll pre-comp again, duplicate my layer, and the bottom copy I'll leave as is, but on the top copy, I will smear using a vertical fast blur. This makes it hardly visible, of course, so then I'll add some curves effect and crank up the alpha curve, so I get this nice smear. If I apply a matte choker to this smear, I can end up with a shape that's taller than the original belt, but narrower by my choke amount. You can see the two shapes overlaid here. Now watch if I subtract this shape from this one. It leaves me with 2 little dots, here and here. I'll pre-comp these together again like a madman, and then with this layer that has these 2 dots, I'll use a matte choker with all its nice geometric simplifiers to convert this into a nice little dot. Then I can duplicate that layer. On the bottom instance, I can use matte choker to bloat it out even more and fill it in white. I'll throw in a little solid here for some nice color difference, and here is our result. And look at these abstract little googly eyes we've created. I'll overlay the original footage as a reminder of what we've created here. In fact, why not quickly mask out these ones that are on my arms with a couple quick keyframes, and check that out. Not bad at all. I'll run the After Effects tracker on this footage, tracking the position, scale, and rotation. I'll use this hip on screen right as point 1 since it's the first to enter and the last to leave screen. The tracker's target null is what I'll call the waist null. And then in the tracking settings, I can say to track the RGB since we have some really clear, distinct solid colors. And then, with only the slightest bit of help, these guide points track through like a dream. And this is why I love After Effects. It's like an old workshop, and you got all these tools that your dad or whoever used to use, but these simple tricks can make some really amazing things. Like googly eye hips, the latest fashion trend. And honestly, once I had these dots here, I could have used any random combination to make all sorts of trackable locators. Now, had I known that the green shirt would work so well and give me so much, including this tracking head start, I would have totally done it for my other examples. But surprise, this series is also an educational experience for me too. Anywho, this bizarre process allowed me to end up with this Knoll that spans the gap across my waist. It scales and rotates appropriately through the comp, and I can parent anything that I want to be part of this effect. Let's start with a solid that will stand in for that surface above my waist. I'll scale and position it, and then I think I'll apply a radial ramp that's white to blue. You know, it's kind of this ethereal thing. I'm not sure if it's a surface or a slight hole into the pants, but either way there's this interior glow of sorts. And since this disc is parented to my waistline, it's just a simple matter of scrolling through and adjusting the shape of my mat every so often to make sure that the edges line up and the perspective kind of matches. I'll also enable the motion blur, and then truly it only takes me a few moments to get myself to this result. Pretty great. Now we need a magic beam emanating from the top of him. Now, how about a very simple approach? Let's make a little square pre-comp over here and add a nice blue solid. Then we'll draw out the shape of a little cone of light. And then we'll add a little circle mask that we can set to intersect, and then feather it out. Now, by now, everyone knows that you can use Trapcode Form to easily create a true 3D array of glowing particles that can dance and disperse with a fractal field. It takes just seconds. But maybe we can go native AE. What do you say? Let's add a solid and apply some fractal noise. We'll add an expression to change the evolution over time, and then we'll add a mask to this small area in the middle. Now I can add CC ball action, which we used all the way back in our Black Panther episode. It's a quick and dirty way to create some dispersed small particles. Now by scattering these particles a bit and adding a time expression to the instability state, look at that. The fractal noise behind is determining some random brightness of these dispersed particles. I can even duplicate this layer now and change the particle size and count a bit. Now, CC ball action is nowhere near as capable as Trapcode Form, but in the right instances, a cheap trick is your best friend. So let's see how it looks if we just place that and parent it right to the waist null. With very little effort, we get this great result. Now, so I can imagine the full potential of these simple layers, I'm going to gather them all and throw them into Supercomp. I've talked about Supercomp before, but as a reminder, it's part of Red Giant's VFX suite, and it's a compositing environment where all the layers are aware of each other. For example, I can add an optical glow to the disk, and the glow from it will wrap in front of the pants layer, even though it's composited behind. And all of these modes are a really quick way to add a little bit of extra to your comp. Because my scene is relatively bright, I'm going to use a trick often necessary for lasers or lightsabers when the scene's too bright. You effectively need to darken the area around that bright laser or, torso beam, whatever you got. I'll approximate this by creating a new dark blue solid, which I can add a small circle feathered mask to. I parent this to the waist null. Then I can add that layer right into my Supercomp stack and move it down below all of my other elements. Even though it's being composited in Supercomp, I can still go right to the layer and adjust the mask points as I need. Now let's take a look at this. Now optically this makes no sense, but this is magic we're talking about. I like the color. Now I noticed a few moments where the edges of my shirt were a little bit visible as artifacts, and with pretty great ease I parented a solid to the hips and then drew a little mask shape to reduce the appearance of these little bits. And once again, since this solid is attached, I only need a handful of keyframes to cover this relatively long shot. Alright, so let's take a look at what we've made. I've added a few little keyframes to fake some camera tilt, and now we've got this goofy little scene of these legs bounding about. And not bad. That's the easy way to do this. I started with a nice keyable shirt. It was a lockdown camera, nice and bright, simple to work with. Well, what if I wasn't wearing a keyable shirt? What if I just, randomly asked my child to film me with my phone and then just walked around like a moron for a bit? I mean, the quality's lower, but I don't know, there's a little bit of energy to the shot and some more challenges, as we'll soon see. Now, the steps are basically the same. Replace the top half with the empty version of this environment, track the hips so you can add in a disc and beams, but as you may have noticed, this isn't a static background, the camera's moving. That means that one of the first steps is using our good old friend, the camera tracker. Now luckily this is a pretty simple track for her. After Effects pretty correctly assumes that this was a tripod-like situation. My kid's holding the camera, not really translating around. Now once we get a track, we can create a plane and a camera, maybe centered here over the fireplace. Then I'll add one over here to the side, and one over here as well. Because of the tripod solve, the planes I create will be arranged a little bit more like a cyc. Now these references will serve an important function in a moment. Now I'm sure you've been in a situation where you forgot to grab an empty plate for something, and so you try to reconstruct the background from different frames. We're going to do something similar here, where we go to export stills from across this clip, with the goal being to make sure that all of the background is revealed at some point behind me walking around. Now there's a ton of motion blur, so I'm scrubbing through looking for helpful frames that also have little to no blur if possible. I'll export and re-import a bunch of those still frames. And now it's time to do some really rudimentary plane projection with these. Alright, so I'll explain the process really clearly this first time. I'm going to repeat it a lot throughout, but here are the basics. I'm going to import a still piece of footage to the same frame that it came from. In this case, 1426. Now when I import the frame, nothing should look different. Obviously it's the same frame it came from. But what I am going to do is I'm going to go to this middle stand-in solid, press P, Shift, R to reveal its position and rotation, and copy those values. I'll make that frame that I just brought in a 3D layer, and then paste those values onto it. As you can see from the side view here, basically it's putting this still frame right where this other stand-in solid is. Now it's not very aligned or anything, so I'm going to use the X and Y gizmos to slide this card until it's sort of centered within frame. Now at this point you can see that if I scrub through my comp, that layer is moving around as if it were filmed with the original camera. Now it's not mapped exactly correctly, so I'm going to go back to the original source frame, which luckily in this case you can see right here in the layer name 1426. I can make sure that matches in my timeline. In fact, if I wanted to, I could press the star key right here so I have a nice little marker, an indicator that this is where the frame came from. Now to align it, I'm going to apply the effect CC Power Pin. I really like the interface of CC Power Pin, where I can just grab each corner and drag it to align with the comp frame. This creates a cool little illusion. The actual layer is still at the proper orientation of the wall back there, but it's being stretched out a little bit so that from the perspective of the camera, it's exactly aligned with what we expected on frame 1426. I'm going to mask off the clean section of this layer that I want to be put into my comp. Now, because of the CC Power Pin, any mask I draw is going to look a little bit weird because the mask is being applied before the CC Power Pin. Since these aren't very dramatic transformations, it's not going to be too bad. But as you can see, I can hone in this nice little rectangle that shows the fireplace, feather the edges a bit, and then if I were to enable motion blur, let me just play you through what this layer is doing now. Now our track was pretty good, and the position of that card stays pretty consistent through the whole comp. I always suggest going to the frame with your marker and adding a keyframe for the position. Then if you want, you can go through your whole comp and find a frame maybe toward the end like this, and double checking the alignment. I can zoom in here and see that it's drifted a teeny bit, but I can just nudge that back into place. So over the course of this timeline, that'll automatically be correcting. On top of these nudge kind of keyframes, you may also want to add some curves or brightness and contrast to these, as the exposure may shift depending on your shot. And that is my favorite way to do an all-in After Effects simple plate projection. Now I believe that on AE Scripts there are some really cool tools for this, but I'm not super familiar with any specific ones enough to teach you guys about them. So what I am going to do is repeat the same process over here, and basically mask, power pin, and nudge a bunch of different sections of frames, and so they're doing basically what this first one did. My end result is this moving background that really approximates what the background looked like behind me nearly the whole time. Since all these layers are working together great, I'm going to pre-comp them together and call them background. I'll also copy and paste a copy of the camera in there, so I won't have to use a collapse transformation always. Now remember before how I said it would have been really cool if I had worn a keyable shirt through all of this? Well, obviously I didn't in this case. Now, I'll spare you the details, but I did try roto-brushing parts of the shirt and the hips and try to recreate that magic of the last one, but I really just proved to myself that the keyed shirt was the real key to making that last one work. Also, this was actually the first one that we shot, and I didn't really know what I was doing. I was trying to figure it out. So what I'm saying, kids, is that mistakes are okay, as long as you're willing to do the hard work it takes to repair them. Hard work for me in this case was manually tracking in a null to be my new waist null throughout the whole comp. Positioning, scaling, and rotating really only took about 20 minutes, but a lot can happen in 20 minutes. That could have been used for something else. I'll wear a green shirt next time. This time around, the mask I used to erase my body also had to have a really faithful waistline, much more than last time since I don't have the benefit of keying. But it just meant a few more mask keyframes. The next few steps are super familiar. In fact, I'm going to copy over my layers from the last one. My background blue darkening piece, my beam, and my hip disc. I'll parent them all to the waist null, and then go through just like before and do a few tweaks on the position, scale, rotation of them, some masks on that hip disc, and what I end up with is this nice handheld version of the legs walking around. Now, one of the things I notice as I'm watching this is that the particles attached to me look a little bit weird as they translate left and right like that. So one of the things I can do is go to my beam layer and increase the speed of these so they move around a little bit more and are less obvious when they track all together as a group. The other thing I could do is I could add a solid, add particular to it, then I'll parent a null to the middle of this waist, and on the position of my particular emitter, I'll use a 2comp expression, just to create a few particles that kind of drift up and away as these pants are walking around. Now, Particular is a 3D plugin, and it's trying to react to this 3D scene camera. I'm actually going to turn off that scene camera, since the background was the only thing that was previously using it, and if you'll remember, I had copied the camera into the background so I wouldn't have to deal with it again. This is technically why. I now have effectively a 2D set of particles, but they at least trail a little bit behind the pants as they walk around. Maybe a nice touch. At the very end, I shop through some magic bullet looks to try to see if I can improve the general look and feel of this shot. I'm also noticing this annoying remote that I left on this couch, and it's really drawing my attention to it. So I'm going to go to my background layer and quickly bring out Spot Clone, which is one of the easiest ways to remove annoyances from shots like this. I can just set the position here, the clone from section to a clean part of the couch, and then run the tracker. Then I can go back to the middle, run the tracker backwards. And what's pretty cool about this tracker is that it did its best to follow the object all the way off the edge of screen. I love tools that make simple work out of what could have been an annoying task to deal with. Instead, 30 seconds. And here is my final effort for this one. It's pretty cool. It's a handheld shot, it's got a little bit of life. And this is totally a preference thing, but I really love the look of handheld captured effects. Obviously. And that, my children, concludes our medium level difficulty shot. And now it's time, people. Time for difficulty level 10. I'm performing with kids. Stand up for real? Stand up for real? I'm having someone unfamiliar with the camera filming this, and somehow the whole thing was shot a little out of focus. Now, normally you'd reshoot, but maybe you kicked your own daughter in the face on the very next take and had to call it a day. She's okay, by the way. I'm so sorry, sweetie.
But it's like you're using the force.
In compositing terms, we've got a lot of issues too. I'm not wearing a green shirt, I'm wearing this white one. The camera is handheld and does more than just pan around. It also follows us up into the living room and then up the stairs. And I also had a very specific camera move in mind for the end where Sophia shrinks for it to work. So I needed to take over the camera work for this last bit of the shot, requiring a hidden cut. Also, the kids are layered right in front of me for large sections of this, coming close to and even making contact with my torso that still needs to be erased. And breaking my own rule, I also run in front of James here for a split second. What I'm saying is I got buckets full of things to solve. And there's no easy way to say this. I just had to roll up my sleeves and commit to finishing. To deal with the out-of-focus issue, I used Magic Bullet Denoiser 3. What I love about Denoiser is that it has a built-in sharpen filter which I can use. But unlike a standard sharpen filter, I'm also able to reduce the amount of noise and grain in the image. So I can take this out-of-focus plate and move it to here using this effect. The next step was trying to camera track this shot to make sure that I had proper locators for all of the background I would need to replace. This proved to be a bigger challenge than I'd originally thought. Because of all the foreground characters running around, the camera tracker had a lot of trouble with the sections where I run close to the camera. So I followed my advice from the very first video I ever made for Red Giant, which is garbage matting out your characters before running the camera tracker. Eventually, I was able to create a decent camera track, and just like in the previous shot, I created some stand-in solids all across the shot as locators for the plates I needed to reproject into the scene. To create these plates, I used the same process as I did in the last shot, where I tried to export still frames from across the shot to make sure that I'd represented the entire background that I was about to pass in front of. Now, it's really important in a shot like this where the camera is moving so much that the background you grab comes from frames pretty adjacent to the motion that's happening right then. And because the characters were all over these frames, a lot of the time that meant jumping into Photoshop, stitching together a few frames to create more clean background plates that I could reproject into the scene. Because of the shaky camera track, a lot of these individual reference frames needed a lot more slight adjustments and keyframes on them to make sure they stayed aligned enough with the original footage. I'll take all of these 20 background layers and render out a piece of video called Background Patches. My final result looked like this. It's a very dynamic camera move, but by stitching all these little bits and pieces together, we've created an amazing dynamic plate. Before I jump right into masking, I realized that a lot of the help in my other shots came from that tracked waistline. You're probably ahead of me on this one, but in this shot, I had to manually track the hips and their alignment throughout the shot. There are some sections where I needed to guess where the hips were when I was behind the kids. Ultimately, the tracking took me 35 minutes to do. And all things considered, for all the benefits I'm going to get from this tracked null, 35 minutes isn't too bad. Just like in some of the examples before, I decided to use this hip null as a way to paste a solid onto myself and then draw masks from there. The first mask I created was called Waist. This is the one that I made sure really conformed to my belt line, and I also included that top foot or so of my hips, so when I place in my effect layers, they can easily slide behind this piece. The second mask I created was for the top half of my body. I needed to make sure that I masked out my elbows as I moved them around, and that somewhere between this waist mask and the top mask, I can extrapolate the shape of the background I need to fill in. Now that this solid is creating the matte shape it needs to, I can apply it as an alpha matte to the original footage, revealing my background patches footage behind it. Once I could finally see this comp coming together, there were definitely a few little things I needed to fix with the background, but that's to be expected. This section of the shot is 23 seconds long. That's an absurdly long shot, and if you're making a movie or short film, it's really unlikely you'd ever have a 23-second shot. In fact, this whole little bit with the kids is meant to be a continuous 50-second shot, where only the first 15 seconds don't have effects. Some of the next steps are, again, very familiar, and once again, really easy because of this tracked hips null. I added in my standard layers for the beam, the backing blue color, and that little hip disc, which is really only visible for this small section of the shot right here. Next, we have the issue of foreground objects. Starting right up here in the front, this stick moves in front of me. That's obviously an issue, so I needed to mask that in. Immediately after, the kids run out and are often obscuring my body. Now, earlier in the shot, if I'd been able to quickly strip into a green screen top half or something like that, perhaps I would have had a little bit of help keying out my kids during these sections, but for right now, I've just got my own 2 hands and roto brush to help me through this. Matting out the foreground objects in this shot took me an hour and a half. So sure, we got all the foreground characters taken care of, wonderful. However, as I mentioned before, I break one of the very few rules I had for myself during this shoot, which is don't run in front of the kids. Because of the random and playful nature of the way we shoot, I forgot about this completely and ran straight in front of James during this section. That means one of the actors is becoming a section of background that needs to be replaced, at least for a few frames. It's a happy accident that I barely obscure him for very long, and that my hips raise up high enough that they cover his face right in the middle here. Because what I was able to do is freeze frame the last frame of James before he's obscured by me, and the first frame when he emerges on the other side. Roto brushed him out, and then was able to place him back into the scene behind my legs for those few frames. Once he's tracked in and the shot is in motion, you can barely tell. Now, if you were online and happened to see this for the first time, even if you have an eye for visual effects, I would hope that a moment like this is at least a little impressive. Now, the second half of this shot was a lot of fun to do, but it's not really what I'm focused on today. If you want to know the basics, I needed to stitch together 2 shots. This one with my friend filming me run up the stairs, and this one with me filming Sophia drop her staff. Sophia drops the staff before shrinking, and so I used content-aware fill to delete her from this little section where she runs out of frame. Now, I'm sure some of you are curious why this is the first time I've mentioned content-aware fill. Now, in my testing, I did attempt to use fill at a few stages of matte replacement earlier. I tried using reference frames and also a nicely tailored mask, but it turns out since part of that mask was right at the waistline, I didn't really get the results that I wanted. I even tried seeing if a broader mask like this would give me a better result. And while this result is impressive and it might have worked really well on a natural setting or something like that, it didn't really work for the purposes here today. But back on the shot with Sophia running out of frame, it worked great. I was able to 3D camera track me moving in and matte in some footage that I had shot of Sophia from the top of the stairs. But hopefully I was able to distract from a lot of the imperfections using some of the particle techniques we did in our Frozen episode, mixed with some awesome assets from Production Crate. Now, speaking of magic, there's also a magic moment earlier in this shot where the kids turn me from full Hashi into half Hashi. I opened up the trailer as some reference and looked at some of the moments where the wand is casting this conjuring spell. Now, this will be happening to me, but in reverse. Currently, there's just a moment where the top half of me pops away in the video. So what I did to help sell this effect was take a still frame of the last moment before I'm obviously lifting up my shirt, and adding some keyframes to a linear wipe that makes me disappear from top to waist. Now we know when and about how fast I'm supposed to disappear. When the wand in Onward is doing its thing, it's got this bright flare at the top of it and casts out these kind of blue, tendrily particle magic things. Let's start by designing a flare that matches this from the movie. It's really quite easy using Knoll Light Factory. I'm going to bring my reference into this scene and create a new black solid. Then I'll add Knoll Light Factory and jump into the designer window. Inside here, I'm actually going to start with my Captain Marvel eyes preset because it's kind of similar with a nice blue stripe in the middle there. And then one by one, I can hide or add different assets and recolor them until I get this star shape and that blue stripe in the middle that feel really similar to the ones from the movie. One of the best parts about this is that once I'm done designing my flare, I can save this preset so it can travel anywhere. Next up, we've got that cool magical particle-y thing that goes from the wand to the feet. And shocker, I'm going to do this using Trapcode Particular. I'm going to create a new template that uses a lot of little pieces and skills we've gathered along the way on Cheap Tricks and from Aaron Rabinowitz's awesome laser rig tutorial that all rely on Particular's awesome ability to turn lights into emitters. Now I've got my solid with Particular. Now I'm going to add a light, a spotlight, it's pretty narrow, called emitter. As soon as I've done that, I can go into Particular and tell it to emit from the lights, change the emitter size to 0, and the direction to directional. Right away, you see that now the light named emitter is shooting out the particles in whatever direction its point of interest is facing. To have some better control over where this magic is going to start, I'm going to add a null called emitter position. And then I'm going to parent the emitter light to that. I'll zero out the position so it's located right on this null object. And then on the point of interest, I'll zero out the X and Y and push it back in Z about 500 pixels or so. So it's pointing forward away from the null, like this. Now I'll add a 3D null called target. I'll push this back in space here, and then over on my null called emitter position, I'll open up the orientation and I'm going to add this expression. Look at the position, meaning of this layer, to the target layer's position compared to the world. And then in the parentheses, I'll put anchor point. Aaron Rabinowitz has a nearly identical setup in his laser gun rig. But for this one-off effect, I just wanted a really simple rig. As we learned on the Sonic episode, one of the great things about emitter lights is that you can quickly duplicate them and place them to different spots, and now you have multiple emitters. From the side view here, you can see that these particles are flying right from these 3 lights right toward that null in the distance. But I have a theory for how I want this effect to work. Down under physics, under air, spherical field, you can add a spherical field. This is basically a sphere that pushes out or sucks in particles around a certain area. I'm going to add an expression to the sphere's position and link it to the world position of my target null. If the strength is positive, it pushes particles away. If the strength is negative, it draws them in. So if I make it a negative strength with a large radius with a nice feather on here, I get this awesome little black hole that sucks in particles right at the location of this null that the lights are all aimed at. Look at this interesting shape we've got going here. Pretty cool, right? Now, just for giggles, let's add like a wiggle expression to this target and see what happens if it were moving around. And look at that. As the target moves around, the beams are pointed at it and then get sucked into the spherical field attached to that same null. Now, to make this path look even more dynamic and magical, I'm going to go to the turbulence field settings under air, and I'm going to play with the effect position amount. I'm going to turn the scale way down and kind of play with the settings until I just get some nice curves. Now, we don't have the time today, but this has so much potential to be like a proton pack stream or all these other sorts of things. I'm really excited to play more with things like this. So my standard way of working with particular is usually working with these simple white particles until I get the motion right before I start putting in fancy glow particles and things like that. But I think we're about at the point that we should switch these to some glow sphere particles, tint them blue, and then maybe see what these would look like with some optical glow. So currently in this setup, the angle of the spotlights that are these emitters control how wide the particles shoot out at the beginning. If this is a really low number, these are nice little streaklets kind of shooting across. The wider they are, the more a mess of particles it becomes. I want a happy balance. I noticed I was kind of guessing the lifespan of these particles based on how soon they needed to die at the middle of this black hole. But just for fun and for nerds, I decided to use a little expression to link the distance between the 2 nulls to the lifespan of the particles, using one length expression to determine that first amount, and then using a linear interpolation expression on the lifespan of the particle. This is all to say the closer together the nulls, the shorter the lifespan, the farther apart they get, the longer the particles live. I visually checked this within my comp, but you're welcome to do anything with it you like. Obviously, when you have great 3D locators like this, you could add something like Knoll Light Factory and use some 2comp expressions to add in that lens flare that we just made to the origin of these particles, and heck, maybe another lens flare to the destination. But enough in this sample comp, let's get it into the shot. Because my comp is already 3D tracked, I can paste these 3D layers in here and position them nicely, adding some keyframes to have this lens flare / origin follow the end of the staff, and the destination to be trained right onto my head down to my hips. I animated some things like the cone angle of the lights at the beginning and end to give me these cool wide bursts of particles that focus in the middle. And of course some keyframes to the lights to have them flicker and pop and give me a little bit of magic. I'm loving the way this is looking, and I'd love to embellish it even more with some of the great assets from Production Crate, just like in last episode. I think I'm addicted. I'll add some smoke puffs to the wand right after it happens, a little bit of an explosion kind of near my body as it disappears. Now I'm really liking the look of this magic, but I feel like when I look at the original there are some more wild and kind of curvy tendrils that come out to the side. I'm going to duplicate my particular layer, and also I'm going to duplicate this first emitter here. I'm going to rename this emitter B-emitter, and then in my second particular copy, I'll switch the naming convention of the lights to be B-emitter as well. You can see if I solo it that this top particular layer is just that one light now. I want this beam to be thinner, so I'm going to reduce the velocity of the particles in particular, and I'm also going to adjust the cone angle to be closer to 0. Now I have a nice thin line following that same turbulence field. But I actually want this to be on a different turbulence field and a little bit wilder. So I'm going to go down to the turbulence settings and then mess a little bit with the offset and the effect position amount. Turning this up, you can see these cool little wisps that go off to the side now. In fact, I might set some keyframes on the particle color because sometimes they seem to lean into red or pink. Here's the final result, and I'm convinced that after some sound design, this is going to turn out beautifully. So now if you'll indulge me, let's take a look at this Action Movie Kid video one more time.
Sophia, what did you do? I don't know what, but whatever it is, I can fix it. Dad, come back. What happened? Dad. What? My bad. Dad, come back. Come back. Dad, wait.
Remembering all the little moments throughout this remind me of just how hard this shot was, but how wonderful it is that it came together. Before we wrap up, I'm going to cram in one more thing, and that's a CG version of this same effect. Just like in so many of our episodes, I think it's cool how simple it is to use Mixamo to create animated characters that work in After Effects. So let's see if we could create something like that in less than 10 minutes. Alright, on Mixamo they've added a bunch of new characters, including this average Joe. Now, the best thing about Joe is that he looks like he's got some pretty straightforward pants, and these kind of onward-looking shoes. And while you could always rig your own 3D humanoid model, or one that you find online, it's really great that he's a default character immediately available. I'll download a handful of animations for Joe, including a simple walk cycle, and maybe some dancing. Then I'll pop up in Cinema 4D, where I can open up an FBX file I just saved, and then over here, I'll delete everything except the pants, belts, and shoes. Once that's done, I can merge this file with another little Cinema 4D file that I made. I've also included an OBJ version of this as well, but it's just a little spiral. Now, this little spiral is going to be textured up with that glow effect later. So what I'll do is I'll drag it to be a child of the hips here, and kind of rotate and position it to look like a cone emitting from the top of the waistline. Once that's done, I'll group everything here in the browser together, and then I'll run steady bake xrec to export a Cinema 4D sequence for After Effects. Now you can pop open After Effects, import the background of your choice. I'm going to use this nice little exterior road shot. I'll camera track it. I'll add a ground plane that's set at the origin right here in the middle. For the sake of normalization, I'll align this solid to the road. I'll attach the camera to this ground solid, and then change its position to 960 by 540 by 0, rotation to 270, 0, 0, and then use a dummy solid to kind of gauge the scale. Then I'll hide the solid. Alright, now we'll add a solid so we can apply element. We'll go ahead and dive in and import our 3D sequence. We'll start with the walk cycle. Comes in nicely. It's this little set of jeans with these napkins sticking out the top of it. Wonderful. But just to be more onward theme, I've created this version with a khaki pants texture. which I can apply like that. And then down on the illumination channel, I can load in this file that I call glow. In the texture, I can scroll down to the illumination settings, turn up the intensity, and change the color to white. We'll go ahead and say OK for now and see what it's looking like. We've got a nice little pair of pants hanging out in the road. Let's go ahead and open up group 1 and create a group Knoll. Now I can scale him up properly, move him back here, and add a few keyframes to the position. If I've guessed anywhere close to right, it'll look like he's walking right along that straight line. Beautiful. Now what about that napkin sticking out the top of him? What should we do with that? I know, we'll apply this custom texture that was built just like our beam that we used in the previous shots. I can drag that little comp right over into ours, then hide it. Then with an element 3D, I can find the custom layers, twirl it open, and under layer 1, I'll select the beam texture. Now if I jump back into my scene materials and click on this material right here, for the diffuse channel, I can use that custom layer. So it looks a little stupid at first, but that's because we got to turn down the glossiness, kind of boost the ambience a little bit, and down under the Advanced tab, we'll change the blending mode to Add. Also at the bottom of Advanced, we'll check Draw Back Faces. This will draw both sides of our spiral. And while we're in here, we'll go ahead and create a primitive plane right here at the bottom. I'll scale it up, and this will translate with him wherever he moves. On the grounds material, we'll go to the advanced settings and click on Matte Shadow. Alright, let's jump out of here. In element settings, I'll make sure that the glow is enabled and that I've turned up a little bit of ambient occlusion. I might even sample one of these dark points from the footage as my ambient occlusion color. And there we go. Once you've set up something like this, it's really easy to swap in different animations that you've saved, and you can finesse these CG legs to your heart's content. I know I'm only kind of scratching the surface here, but that's a quick lesson on how you could do this. We cover this exact same workflow in a bunch of our episodes, and so my hope is that by now you're starting to roll this into your arsenal of things you can do in After Effects. We've covered some simple effects and some more challenging ones. The VFX dad in me hopes that you learned something fun today. I think that knowing how to erase things from a handheld shot is a skill that could prove useful in a million different ways. We also took on problems that didn't have a solution until we invented one. And honestly, every VFX artist I know is a problem solver, and the world needs problem solvers. Earlier I also said that mistakes are okay as long as you're willing to do the hard work of fixing them, and the world needs hard workers. This shot was stupid hard. But the sweat put into rotobrushing these kids means that I got to have this genuine, wonderful performance where the blocking wasn't awkward and we didn't need to avoid crossing each other's space. You see, each time you add a constraint to a shot, like it's got to be locked off or you can't have a character cross a section, people start to pick up on that. That's why I really love capturing things live with all of their glorious problems and issues and fixing it in post. One of the most wonderful things about being alive during the time of easy camera tracking and After Effects and awesome plugins and simplified tools like this is that a shot like this would have been really difficult to approach, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. But now we can literally let our imagination come to life. I can let my kids really interact with me running around like an idiot in this scene, and their performance is so much better for it. My children, it's been a pleasure. Feel free to check out my fatherly pastime at Action Movie Kids, and check out even more VFX wisdom, probably also scattered with dad jokes, at redgiant.com. Reach out to us anytime on Twitter to share the things that you've conjured at home, and have a magical day.